So here we are, the last lecture of the course. We've talked in this unit, Earth Systems and Agriculture, about the basics of geology, how we get minerals from the earth, and some of the underpinnings of agriculture. Now let's get into making agriculture sustainable. As always, we've got some objectives for the lecture. We're going to look at the challenges of feeding the human population. We're going to look, we mentioned the Green Revolution last chapter, but we're going to get a little deeper into it. We're going to look at how we raise animals for food and assess those impacts. We're going to look at pest and weed management. We're going to look at we're going to look a little bit into genetic engineering and do a cost-benefit analysis of genetically modified foods and look at the public debate over them. We're going to look at organic agriculture, and we're going to look at some of the potential pathways we can use to get to sustainable agriculture. So industrialized agriculture, as we've talked about, has boosted the world production of food and fiber tremendously to the point where we can feed over 8 billion people, but it has brought a lot more pollution and resource depletion. We are producing more food per person, which increases this idea of food security. Food security is the guarantee of an adequate, safe, nutritious, and reliable food supply. People know where their next meal is coming from. Increasing food security has a negative impact of a lot of soil degradation and soil decline, and using most of the planet's arable land or land that's usable for agriculture. Okay, there are a lot of people in this world, in this nation, in this state, in this county, in this community that are lacking food security. They don't know where their next meal is going to come from. So despite the fact that we've improved food production, there are over 800 million people that suffer from something called undernutrition, which is when you receive fewer calories than your diet requires. The opposite of that is overnutrition, and many of the developing countries are seeing an increase in this due to the abundance of cheap junk food and sedentary lifestyles, developed countries, excuse me. So this extra weight leads to a lot of the health issues that we see: heart disease, diabetes, stroke, cancer, and some of those other associated health issues. Malnutrition is when you are short of particular nutrients, lipids, proteins, vitamins, or minerals. If you have a protein deficiency, you can develop something called kwashiorkor, and that's this little guy here. It causes abdominal bloating, the deterioration of hair, mental disabilities, and other issues. And if you don't have enough calories in addition to protein deficiency, you can develop a situation called marasmus. If you are anemic, you have low iron in your blood. So how has agriculture changed over time? 10,000 years ago, we started to domesticate and raise animals for plants and food. When we were not so much hunter-gatherers anymore, where we could stay in societies and villages, we really started to develop culture and organized government. And this is some of the origins of these crops that we wind up using today. The Green Revolution in the 1940s is the result of this guy, Norman Borlaug. It's when we looked at new crop varieties, technologies, and farming practices. So he introduced disease-resistant high-yield wheat to Mexico. That then increased Mexico's wheat production. They tripled it, and they used those same practices in India and Pakistan. So in addition to those crop varieties, they have also used synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, irrigation, and fossil fuel-powered machinery. It has then taken India from a country with high rates of starvation and a lot of poverty to a net exporter of grain. So they have more than what their people need. So it increased per person food production by 48%, but only increased land use by 11%. So we're preserving biodiversity. But the downside of that is that we're using fertilizers, pesticides pretty intensely, which is increasing pollution, erosion, and decreasing water and air quality. So it's not such a good thing. We look at conventional industrial agriculture. We talked about monocultures. So it's increasing efficiency, but it's also decreasing biodiversity. You get a lot of bang for your buck from these rows of corn. But those monocultures are more susceptible to disease and insect pests. So grubs, worms, viruses, blights, anything like that. In a monoculture, you're likely to wipe out your whole crop. To do agriculture sustainably, you need farming and grazing strategies that maintain healthy soil, clean water, pollinators, and genetic diversity, and other things that we wind up needing long term. In order to do that, okay, we need to reduce fossil fuel use and pollution, particularly from inorganic fertilizers. So how can we do that? Increase organic farming, improving technologies, and using greater use of genetically modified crops in our farms. So if we raise animals for food, okay, and that's become more of a trend as overall affluence on the planet has increased. So the more affluent you are, the more disposable income you have to eat meat, milk, eggs, and other animal products. It's gone up tremendously since 1950, as you can see here. When we choose to eat animals, right, we talked about this in Unit 2, only 10% of the energy that we get from, that the cow gets from the grass makes it to us, okay? So feeding grain to a cow and eating beef from that cow means that most of the grain's energy is lost to the cow, right? Eating lower on the food chain, as we talked about earlier, is more energy efficient because you're really only you only need resources to create those plant products rather than the animal products. And then it reduces our ecological footprint. So traditionally, folks who are vegan have the lower ecological footprints. The efficiency of conversion from feed to animal product, it varies depending on what you're talking about. So for every 20 kilograms of feed that you put into a cow, you get a kilogram of beef. So that is really inefficient. Milk is more efficient, right? For every 1.1 kilograms of feed, you get a kilogram of milk. You can look at the land required to produce land, water, and greenhouse gas emissions to produce a kilogram of protein. You know, cows are really a lot higher than everything else pretty much across the board. So how can we raise animals? How do we raise animals? We use these things called feedlots, okay? They're factory farms or CAFOs, which is confined or concentrated animal feeding operation. You put a bunch of organisms in one area in high density, okay? You provide high energy feed to really allow those organisms to grow quickly, to mature quickly, to be processed and sent to stores as quickly as possible. So it's a quick turnover. They're economically efficient, and you reduce grazing impacts. So you reduce the risk of overgrazing. And they increase the fraction of food that goes straight to the energy to produce body mass, okay, to increase that animal's body mass. The downsides, okay, you can increase concentrated waste, right? The potential for pollution is a lot higher. Okay, so nutrient pollution, if you have these manure ponds that wind up running off, right? They can't stay contained. That manure runs off into surface water and it's going to cause eutrophication, right? Sometimes that waste contains bacterial or viral pathogens, right? Also in that waste, sometimes in these CAFOs, they give hormones and antibiotics to prevent the spread of disease or to curb the spread of disease. They may be in the waste that winds up overflowing the ponds, that winds up getting into the water supply. And if you overuse these antibiotics, it can create antibiotic resistance, and you get the super bugs that can really do pretty severe damage to the natural ecosystems. Another way you can raise meat is through free-range grazing, and there's a picture of free-range grazing. So it is exactly what it sounds like. Animals are allowed to graze on grass for their entire life cycles, okay? This meat grown or raised in this way tends to be free of antibiotics or those chemicals that we use in the CAFOs. The waste can be used as fertilizer for the crops, but it's really expensive. It requires a lot of land. So the meat from free-range grazed animals tends to be more expensive for consumers. We talked about the idea of overgrazing, and you can see the overgrazed versus the not overgrazed in the picture. It occurs when too many animals feed on a particular area of land. You lose vegetation, which can lead to soil erosion, and it can also lead to desertification. So one thing that they're looking at doing is called lab-grown meat. It's genetically identical to animal meat, but it doesn't have the environmental impacts. It's also called cultured meat. It's a potential solution. If we're looking at the raising of seafood, we can do something called aquaculture, okay? As we've decreased wild fish populations due to overharvesting, like we talked about in chapter 16, aquaculture, basically fish farming, or oyster farming or farming any kind of thing, might be the answer. We use lots of fish when we do aquaculture. It's grown quite a bit in the last 30 years. It increases food supplies and protein sources, which then increases overall food security. And it reduces overfishing and bycatch, okay? However, if you do it in an industrial way, in a large scale way, it may necessitate antibiotic overuse, okay? Because you have so many organisms so densely packed, you may require antibiotics. If you do it poorly and you're not careful about it, you can destroy coastal ecosystems. You can spread disease or invasive species if those farmed organisms escape into the surrounding ecosystem, right? You can have highly competitive species. So if we're going to look at croplands, right, we need to look at controlling pests and weeds. A pest is any organism that damages crops or livestock, and a weed is any plant that competes with crops. Because monoculture is so genetically non-diverse, genetically homogeneous, it really decreases the ability to withstand disturbance due to pests, right? So if they can't control it naturally, they're going to turn to chemical suppression. So pesticides are synthetic chemicals that kill insects, plants, and fungi. If it's a pesticide that kills an insect, we call it an insecticide. If it's a plant, we call it an herbicide. And if it kills a fungus, we call it a fungicide. There are nearly 400 million kilograms of pesticide ingredients that are applied in the United States every year, like this guy who's applying some kind of pesticide. Exposure to pesticides. Pesticides have improved food production, but there are negative impacts that come out of it. So farm workers, like that guy in the previous slide, are going to have the highest levels of exposure, okay? Exposure to Roundup, which is a known carcinogen, and other issues with lungs, and exposure to chemicals that we really don't know what the impacts are going to be. And we eat it when we eat non-organic produce. So it's why you wash all your fruit. Pesticides also kill non-target organisms, things that we're not trying to kill, including predators and parasites of pests, things that are going to naturally reduce the pest population, and pollinators, okay? For example, glyphosate, which is Roundup, has reduced milkweed populations so much that we've lost species, many, many millions of monarch butterfly individuals, to the point where the monarch is on the border of being endangered, if not already endangered. We talked about these in the last chapter. Neonicotinoids. They make the crops toxic to insects that feed on them, but they are also causing issues with bees and pollinators, and can kill the predators that are natively feeding on the pests of the plant. So this is an important idea. Pests are going to evolve resistance to pesticides, okay? So what winds up happening is that pests are going to occur in huge numbers. And because you have a large population, you're going to have some pests that are genetically resistant to a pesticide that is applied, okay? So they may be resistant to it. They may not die. They may be able to metabolize it, okay? So that pesticide is applied. Most of the pests die, but a certain number that have that resistance, genetic resistance to that pesticide, are going to survive. They're going to survive, they're going to reproduce, and they're going to pass that gene onto their offspring so that the next time they apply that pesticide, it's not going to kill as many, right? Because more of them have that resistance gene, right? So that creates something called a pesticide treadmill. So in order to kill that new population, you can't use the old pesticide, you have to create a new pesticide. And the same process is going to keep happening again and again and again. There's a great picture, okay? Those survivors breed and produce a pesticide-resistant population, so they're going to attack the crops and apply a new pesticide, and it just keeps going around and around. One other way to deal with pests is something called biological controls, where you bring in natural predators or parasites of a pest to eliminate it. They did that in the 1920s with the cactus moth, and it did a great job destroying the cactus moth, but it wound up starting to attack the native cacti. And they did this in Australia in the cane fields in Queensland with the cane toad, and we all know how well that worked out. There's a modern example as well. When a pest is non-native, it can become invasive because you don't know how that's going to wind up working out. Okay, you don't know how that new species is going to be predicted. The effects of that can be predicted. So the cactus moth was used in the Caribbean countries, and it's now consuming, as I had said, native cacti. So how do we do it? What's the best method to deal with these pests? It's this idea of integrated pest management, or IPM. And every year, I, as a science teacher and a teacher in the building, I have to go through a course on IPM. You combine biocontrol, right? So introducing those other species, chemical pesticides, habitat alteration, crop rotation, transgenic crops, alternative tilling methods, and mechanical pest removal. You kind of have to figure out, take a wide angle view of the problem, really start to analyze it, and figure out what combination of these methods is going to work best. It's definitely not a one-size-fits-all circumstance, okay? It's been really effective in Indonesia, okay, for increasing rice production, but also decreasing pesticide use. Another way we can deal with the agriculture in the world to feed all these people is the idea of using genetically modified food. So genetic engineering is any process where scientists directly manipulate an organism's genetic material, or its DNA. So it's a form of biotechnology, which is a really popular area to major in if you want to go into college and major in genetics. So we have our ways of modifying food. We've done traditional selective breeding. We talked about that when we talked about dog species, and that's how we got Brussels sprouts and cabbage and broccoli and cauliflower from an ancient mustard, okay? You can use mutagenesis, so you expose species to radiation in order to increase mutation rates to make those new traits come out more quickly. If you make foods from these genetically modified organisms, we call them genetically modified foods, right? So an organism with DNA from another species is called transgenic, okay? Recombinant DNA, which was used to create Roundup Ready soybeans, they're resistant to Roundup, is where you take DNA and you patch it from multiple sources. Right, so there's a little diagram for it. You can also edit genes using CRISPR. So a white mushroom that does not brown on store shelves was our first gene-edited food. So we've edited the genome of this white button mushroom with a set of scissors that it's called CRISPR. We've talked about CRISPR. To make it so that it stays white longer, fresher longer. So we have a lot of GM crops that we use around the world. One is golden rice. There were a lot of people in Asia that had developed vitamin A deficiency, and they have used it to reduce the issues related with vitamin A deficiency. BT cotton, Roundup Ready alfalfa, virus-resistant papaya, GM salmon, potatoes, soybeans, etc. Corn and sunflowers. So it's transforming a lot of the products around us. 5 countries, the US, Brazil, Argentina, India, and Canada, account for 90% of the GM crop production. If you look at what we use mostly, it's mostly soybeans and then corn. And more than half of the world's GM crops are produced in developing countries, which makes sense because that's where Borlaug's Green Revolution was introduced. So what are the pros of GM crops? Okay, typically they've been engineered to resist insects and to be tolerant of herbicides, which is going to benefit industrial farmers, right? So what can GM crops do? They can enhance food security and reduce poverty. They can reduce pressure to clear forest and grasslands, which then preserves habitat, which then preserves biodiversity. You can conserve water by reducing the need for irrigation. You can improve nutrition. You can create crops that are more visually appealing to consumers. Nobody wants to eat an ugly tomato, right? But if you get a tomato that looks really nice, currently they taste disgusting. And it reduces pesticide and fossil fuel usage. So there are pros to GM crops. All right. GM crops have had documented benefits. You're increasing yields, you're boosting farmers' profits, and you're reducing chemical pesticide use, all of which is good. Okay. Herbicide use is growing because we are using more herbicides. So just like we had the pesticide treadmill, we wind up with an herbicide treadmill as well. There are more species that are resistant to herbicides. So what are the risks? What are the downsides? We haven't currently, using scientific research, detected significant health hazards from using genetically engineered crops, okay? So it's not, to our knowledge, current research, causing any significant health hazards. Ecologically, there's a concern that GMO crops are going to interbreed with their wild relatives, then putting these new genes into the wild population, okay? Some people feel that we should adopt what Europe does when it comes to new products. We should adopt that precautionary principle, but that's not how it works in the United States. A big part of that public debate is that every person needs food, and it's fair to to make sure that everybody has food, but in the same breath, you're forcing people to consume these biotech products because a lot of our foods are made of corn, rice, soy, and wheat. So that's another concern. Another concern is that it's kind of a monopoly. There are only a few companies, big companies, that control that GM technology: Bayer, Dow, DuPont, and BASF. Okay, so there's only a few companies that are involved in it. So is that really considered fair? They also patent their genes, so that way, if a farmer who is growing non-GM crops, their crops are pollinated by a neighbor's farm who is growing GM crops, then the non-GM crop farmer can be sued for harvesting and replanting his own seeds. And it's actually happened. So what's an alternative? It's this idea of organic agriculture. You know about organic agriculture. If you go to the grocery store, you see it. Food is grown using practices that do not include synthetic pesticides, fertilizers, hormones, or antibiotics. And the Organic Food Production Act of 1990 established standards by which food can be labeled as organic. And these are those standards. Okay, it's got to be free of prohibited substances for 3 years. The crops aren't genetically engineered. They're not irradiated. You can't use sewage sludge, and you need to use organic seeds and planting stock. So why hasn't it taken off? It is expensive. It's 10 to 30% more expensive than conventional products. Organic milk can cost up to twice as much. When my daughter was little, I was buying organic milk, and it is definitely expensive. Oh, more that we need to do for crops to be considered organic. They can't use synthetic fertilizers, and they can't use conventional pesticides, right? And this is how, if you're going to be organic livestock, how you have to do it. Organic agriculture is on the rise. Most grocery stores, your common grocery stores, offer it. Demand and production have both gone up because people are seeing the benefit of it. It yields about 80% of conventional agriculture. And if we are more mindful of our food waste, if we wind up wasting less food and we reduce meat consumption, in addition to improving in technology, we could wind up having more organic agriculture feeding a larger part of our population. So what are the challenges to dealing with sustainability? We have to deal with soil degradation, overconsumption of water, losing crop diversity, pollinators, and natural habitats. We need to look at our reliance on fossil fuels and therefore the greenhouse gas emissions that result. One way we can support sustainable agriculture is going to local farmers markets, right? This is crazy to me. The average food product sold in a U.S. supermarket travels at least 1,000 miles from farm to market. That totally increases the ecological footprint of that food. If you buy local at a farmer's market, right, you are reducing the transportation cost tremendously. You could also do something called community-supported agriculture, where customers pay farmers in advance for a share of a crop box or a portion of a share, and then they get weekly deliveries of produce, whatever the farmer has harvested during that week. Okay. You can do a life cycle analysis to look at all the inputs and outputs. Food miles, in this case, according to this life cycle analysis, contribute to only 4 or 5% of greenhouse gas emissions. But about 83% of greenhouse gas emissions related to agriculture typically come from the farm or the feedlot in producing animal products. So going vegan will significantly reduce your ecological footprint. Hydroponics are another way of reducing the impact that we have on land. So you grow it in water-based, nutrient-rich solutions instead of soil. You're using less transportation costs. You're definitely using a lot less land and less water. So you can operate them year-round indoors. And there's an example of tomatoes being grown hydroponically. Again, sustainable agriculture, sustainable anything. If you got nothing else from this course, in order for them to be sustainable, we want to follow these natural ecosystems. And they use negative feedback loops, right? So finding negative feedback loops. And this example of rice farming in Japan shows that. All right, there it is, guys, the end of our course.